I'm sorry for no here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a serious review of the new Negură Bunget album, Tau. Negură Bunget is a black metal project with folk metal and progressive rock leanings, and when it comes to metal of the folk variety, I do tend to be a little picky. There are some groups that just add folk instrumentation to an already overproduced mix, which is kind of a turnoff for me, where the guitar tones are just really tame and the drums sound super synced up and just perfect technical flawlessness, and then just throwing some acoustic instrumentation on top of that. I'm just not into it. It just kind of feels like placing window dressing on top of an already sort of uninteresting sound. I prefer it much more when a band can sort of use folk music as a base and then add some drums, some electric instrumentation, some loud guitars into the equation without losing the organic feel and the dynamics of folk music. And there are a lot of great artists who over the years have been able to do that successfully. Agalloch and Ulver, as well as the new Panopticon record, which I thought was really great. Irish band Primordial as well, and I would say this band has done so too with records like Ohm. With the very glossy and sometimes very ambient synthesizers on this record, the woodwinds, and the other instrumentation too. Ohm is not just a dynamic record, but it's a menacing record too, with how heavy some of the guitars can be and the very dark, abrasive vocals. And even as you move backwards into the band's discography, there are still some interesting releases, even when they were just more of a straightforward black metal band before folk music played such a large role in their style. On such releases, the band would play black metal with such explosive intensity that I think it would grab the attention of any fan of the genre. And since these days, the band has undergone quite a bit of sonic evolution, and I think on this record over here we see that evolution at a standstill, which isn't the worst thing in the world. If you're doing something well, keep at it. But unfortunately, Tau is just not doing it for me in the same way that previous records from this project have. The intensity of previous records I don't really think is here. Some of this album's most powerful moments can be summed up with just some mid-pace double bass drums, some dreary but very basic chord progressions, and these large, clean-voiced choruses that feel more lethargic than epic as the band uses them over and over and over throughout the album. And I think the synths sound great on this LP. If I am hearing real brass on this album, that sounds pretty good as well, but some of the woodwinds on here can be kind of rough with how they're mixed and how exactly they're not really following the flow and the tempo of some of the songs that they're playing over. The third track here, as soon as the woodwind solo enters on this song, it just kind of feels like I'm listening to just a cut from a really rough practice session that was just, for whatever reason, overdubbed and spliced into the mix here. There's even a spot on the opening track here where there's this incredibly loud and wavy lead melody, if you could call it that. It kind of sounds like it's coming from a theremin or something like that, and it's just very eerily all over these metal drums and guitars, and it really just kind of ruins the overall mood of the track. Previously, I've found much of Negură Bunget's incorporation of instrumentation other than guitars, drums, bass to be tasteful, but that just doesn't seem to be the case on Tau. Even some of the more subtle and acoustic spots on this record don't end up being complemented by the heavier passages that may follow, like on the acoustic intro that kicks the entire album off, which sounds fantastic, really sets a tone for the record, but all of a sudden it's just smothered by these electric guitars that don't really follow the pace of the acoustic instrumentation melodically in any way, really. It's like the band just didn't want to build off of this fantastic start and just crushed it instead with some run-of-the-mill black metal guitars. So while there are some lengthy tracks on this release here, the multiple parts that are jammed into these songs don't necessarily make for an engaging experience from beginning to end as it might have on previous releases. With all of these kind of lethargic drums and guitars and group vocals, I actually find most of this album to be kind of one-dimensional, except for one particular cut on the back end of this album, which when it kicks off has a really bouncy beat, some quirky dulcimer. It sounds like a piece of folk music straight out of the Eastern Bloc. Negură Bunget is really playing up their Romanian roots on this track. But even here, again, I feel like they're not fully complementing the kind of music that they're playing so well in a sense, especially once this shredding guitar solo just comes in out of nowhere. It just seems like a little much. Overall, for me, this is just a really weird record in this band's discography. In a lot of ways, it doesn't really feel like it's too far off from their previous releases in terms of just tone and style. But then again, in the most subtle of ways, this album just feels really lackluster in comparison to those releases. With the lackluster incorporation of folk instrumentation, the lackluster songs, the numerous disjointed parts that make up these tracks. There are moments on this record that feel like they're in bad taste or maybe just a little overkill. And yet again, so much of this album sounds kind of lifeless and just lacking in the intensity that I've come to expect from Negură Bunget. I don't think this album is god-awful or anything like that, but really, after numerous listens, I'm just super, super indifferent toward it. That's really how I am feeling. Indifference, pure indifference much of the time. I'm feeling a strong 5 to a light 6 on this LP. Transition. If you've given this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Anthony Fantano, Negură Bunget, Tau, forever.